Hello and welcome back to As an Aggregator, a channel designed around connecting consumers to content one title and thumbnail at a time. Remember, if you feel sandboxed by your YouTube algorithm, this is how you escape your filter bubble. The value that you receive is the content we curate because we provide a hyper edge. All right, now jumping back in, we're just taking a dip, a step, a stroll through our long run consume digest by acknowledging some of the pieces of literature that have impacted our worldview. Recently, we've been going through David Hume's work and starting that, trying to roll that ball down the stream. But this book was really the first book that started it all, not in general, but specifically for this channel as an aggregator. Why? Because I was introduced to this book via Paul Beckwith, and he mentioned Jacques Ellul with regards to his book on propaganda. And this channel, this project is retired, also has this audiobook in case you're interested. But that led me to the author, and the author led me to the Technological Society, and the Technological Society had me thinking, whoa, what do they mean when they say technique? What does that even mean? And why do I keep on hearing this term over and over? Do I understand it? What do I think about it? How do I relate to this concept? And so this was at the end of 2022. So synchronistically, it was quite amazing actually to sit there and to absorb this book, to entertain this book right before the advent of ChatGPT getting released into the wild. Since then, we've had all sorts of AI culture commentary, from the doomers to the techno optimists to everywhere in between. And to see this as a psychological dichotomy laid bare in relation to dichotomies between theories of minds based on their perspectives and their personal cross-section of concerns. Yeah, it's fascinating to juxtapose that in its own kind of semi-silo in relation to overshoot culture commentary and environmental culture commentary related to climate change, where you have a similar cross-section of doomers and it's the techno optimists. Now, you can argue that there's more evidence for one side or the other, and we'll get into that into this channel, but I just wanted to establish a little bit of context for the impact of this book on my consume digest, because the Technological Society truly frames out the issue and the problems of this modern world, not directly in terms of the question of psychological types, but more specifically in relation to, hey, okay, so what is technique exactly, and why is it that, like, the events that are transpiring, like, do we just, like, consciously and unconsciously, do we just find this specific gradient based on what works? And how does this reaction between the use of potentially introverted psychological functions as a gradient in terms of what people might think of as, well, we're jumping around a little bit, but specifically when someone says that they discovered a preferred gradient of, let's say, technique, what does that mean as a mode of accomplishment? I remember recently we were studying the Gaussian copula in relation to the turn of the century financial culture commentary, where people were able to bundle financial instruments. So on the one hand, there's a moral argument in terms of, hey, when there's a new development of technique, do you just absorb it versus, hey, well, we're just testing it to see it, because if it works, then it's a part of our environment, so we have to keep on going to follow that gradient of technique because it provides us something that's preferable. And then taking that as a cross-section of the present moment, where we're saying, hey, let's take action now in relation to this. versus saying, whoa, but we've been doing this for so many decades, centuries, and millennia. From the dawn of time, quite literally, to the dawn of consciousness in terms of a bicameral mind, in terms of the discrepancy between prehistory and history, in terms of language, the switchover between iconographic languages to phonographic languages. So that was a bit of an intro for me. Next, we're going into the translator's introduction. Jacques Ellul is a French speaker, so this is being translated into English. Let us begin. Wait, hold up. Okay, so jumping back into the translator's introduction.
20th century. Translator's introduction. Jacques Ellul as the philosopher of the Technological Society. Ernst Junger once wrote that technology is the real metaphysics of the 20th century. The irreversible collectivist tendencies of technology, whether it calls itself democratic or authoritarian, were already apparent to him at the end of World War I. It is this society in all its forms which Jacques Ellul of the Faculty of Law of Bordeaux seeks to analyze. Professor Ellul, unlike most of the other surviving leaders of the French resistance, still functions as a voice of conscience for a France which seems to feel itself in danger of being overwhelmed from literally every point of the compass by the materialistic values of the Cold War consumer society. Greater influence is enjoyed by others, such as Malraux and Sartre, but Malraux is in the service of the welfare state, albeit one with Gallic flourishes, and Sartre is growing rich by dispensing absinthe morality in the cellars of the left bank. I sometimes wonder, says Ellul in a related connection, about the revolutionary value of acts accompanied by such a merry jingle of the cash register. Ellul's principal work, this book, appeared under the title La Technique and the subtitle L'enjeu du siècle. The subtitle, which means literally the stake of the century, is a characteristically dark and difficult Ellulian phrase, which may or may not refer to a kind of Pascal wager put on technology by 20th century man. The technique of the title, however, lends itself more easily to interpretation, although, characteristically, it too is used in a sense it does not usually enjoy. Technique, the reader discovers more or less quickly, must be distinguished from the several techniques which are its elements. It is more even than a generalized mechanical technique. It is, in fact, nothing less than the organized ensemble of all individual techniques, which have been used to secure any end whatsoever. Harold Laswell's definition comes closest to Ellul's conception: the ensemble of practices by which one uses available resources to achieve values. This definition has the merit of emphasizing the scope of technique, but Ellul's further account makes it clear that it does not go far enough, since technique has become indifferent to all the traditional human ends and values by becoming an end in itself. Our erstwhile means have all become an end, furthermore, which has nothing human in it and to which we must accommodate ourselves as best we may. We cannot even longer pretend to act as though the ends justified the means, which would still be recognizably human, if not particularly virtuous. Technique, as the universal and autonomous technical fact, is revealed as the technological society itself, in which man is but a single, tightly integrated and articulated component. The technological society is a description of the way in which an autonomous technology is in process of taking over the traditional values of every society without exception, subverting and suppressing these values to produce at last a monolithic world culture, in which all non-technological difference and variety is mere appearance. The technical malaise so deeply felt in non-communist Europe at the imminent takeover has brought forth in recent years an astonishingly large number of literary, philosophic, and sociological analyses of the technical phenomenon. One of the great merits of Ellul's book arises from the fact that he alone has pushed such analysis to the limit in all spheres of human activity and in the totality of their interrelatedness. It may be added that what some authors feel to be the book's demerits arise from the same source. They maintain that society, more often than not, refuses to be pushed to that reductio ad absurdum, which is the inevitable end point of every thoroughgoing analysis. The books of such authors generally end on a note of optimism. A final chapter always asks, what is to be done? Unfortunately, their answers to the question are either inefficacious myths which confront reality with slogans, or only too efficacious technical solutions to technical problems which end only in subjecting man the more thoroughly to technology. The former are exemplified by most modern religions, philosophical systems, and political doctrines. The latter by schemes for mass education or mass cultivation of leisure, which in Ellul's analysis are themselves highly impersonal and technicized structures having much more in common with the assembly line than with what mankind has traditionally designated by these names. The technological malaise seems to have been much less acutely felt in the United States. Individuals such as Aldous Huxley, Paul Tillich, and Erich Fromm, who have raised their voices in protest, are of European origin and received their education in Europe. Technolators such as Professors B.F. Skinner of Harvard and most other American professors represent the familiar type of the American intellectual caught in an ecstatic technical vertigo and seldom proceeding beyond certain vague meditations on isolated problem areas such as the population explosion, if indeed he considers the real problems posed by technology at all. Ellul holds the Americans to be the most conformist people in the world, but in fairness it must be objected that, in his own analysis, the Soviets seem better to deserve
in the
this
mid-20th
dubious
century.
honor, since
I'm
they have made
thinking in
even
between
politics into a technique.
1940 and 1960.
The Americans, apart from
or 1970,
technicizing the electoral
1940 to
process,
1970.
have left at least the sphere of politics to the operations of amateurish bunglers, and have thereby preserved a modicum of humanity. It may be added that France, too, has been taken into the technological orbit with a speed which must have astonished Ellul. De Gaulle's plans for his new France contemplate
the book was published in French in
technicization of French society
1954
in 9 years,
and in English in
instead of the quarter
1964.
century of grace which Ellul predicts in his book. Since the religious object is that which is uncritically worshipped, technology tends more and more to become the new God. This is true for all modern societies, but especially so for communist societies, since Marxism, in Ellul's analysis of it, consciously identifies the material infrastructure upon which the social superstructure is raised with technology. Footnote: Ellul once again showed much prescience. Marxist publications of the last few years have come to speak of the technical material infrastructure instead of the material infrastructure.
Okay, so we're going to back this up a
The
little bit.
expression of technological is more and more to become the new God. This is true for all modern societies, but especially so for communist societies, since Marxism, in Ellul's analysis of it, consciously identifies the material infrastructure upon which the social superstructure is raised with technology. Footnote: Ellul once again showed much prescience. Marxist publications of the last few years have come to speak of the technical material infrastructure instead of the material infrastructure. The expression of technological malaise in the Soviet Union or in Red China, where technology has become the new establishment, would be blasphemy in the strictest sense of the word. In composition and style, Ellul's book is certain to be an enigma, and even a scandal to many. It is not sociology, political economy, history, or any other academic discipline, at least as these terms are usually understood. It will not even appear to be philosophy to a generation whose philosophic preoccupations are almost exclusively analytic. Ellul himself is in doubt about the value of the designation philosopher. But if we think back to the dialectical philosophies of the whole of thinkers usually understood, or any other academic discipline, political economy, history, to many. It is not sociology, political economy, history, or any other academic discipline, at least as these terms are usually understood. It will not even appear to be philosophy to a generation whose philosophic preoccupations are almost exclusively analytic. Ellul himself is in doubt about the value of the designation philosopher. But if we think back to the dialectical philosophies of the whole of thinkers such as Plato and Hegel, Ellul's book is philosophy. If an American specialist, say, in economics, with his terribly linear logic and his apparently unshakable conviction that his arbitrarily delimited systems can and should be studied in isolation from all others, were to flip open Ellul's book to those sections which treat of matters economic, it is conceivable that he would be repelled by what he found. But if this same specialist could somehow or other implausibly be persuaded to persevere in the attempt to see with Ellul economics in the light of the whole of modern technical culture, it is likewise conceivable that he would gain important insights, not perhaps into the fine structure of academic economic problems, but in the border region where his subject abuts on other disciplines, in that area where basic discoveries in economics and everything else are always made by gifted amateurs, who, faute de mieux, must be called philosophers. Ellul's admittedly difficult style is not to be referred to that style erroté affected by so many post-war French existentialists. An element of this is doubtless present, but it would be much more accurate to say that in an essentially dramatic work, such as the present book must be deemed to be, the transitions and turns of thought must have a character entirely different from those to be encountered in the ultra-respectable academic texts which have taken over from mathematics certain linear and deductive modes of presentation. Modes which, whatever their pedagogic value may be, serve, even in mathematics, only to obscure the way in which truth comes into being. To its dramatic presentation of what are, after all, well-known facts, Ellul's book owes its high persuasive quality. This dramatic character would have been clearly evident if the book had been written as a dialogue. Indeed, a reader could easily cast it into this form by representing to himself the various thinkers who are introduced by name as the dramatis personae, and by treating the nameless on the one hands and on the other hands in the same way. In this way, the successive recantations of some positions and the development of others in the light of a guiding concept of the whole become clear, and the book's essential affinity to a Platonic dialogue like the Republic is evident. Nowhere is this successive recantation more evident than in the first chapter's search for definitions. Even clearer is the similarity of the book to Hegel's Phänomenologie des Geistes, the last work of Western philosophy with which, in the translator's opinion, the present work bears comparison. The technological society is not a phenomenology of mind, but rather a phenomenology of the technical state of mind. Like Hegel's book, it is intensely histrionic, and like it shows without offering causal mechanisms how its subject, in its lowest stage, technique as machine technique, develops dialectically through the various higher stages to become at last the fully evolved. It shows without offering causal mechanisms how its subject, in its lowest stage, technique as machine technique, develops dialectically through the various higher stages to become at last the fully evolved phenomenon. the technical phenomenon identical with the technical society. Again, as with Hegel, what the philosopher J. Lowenberg has called the histrionic irony of statement must drive the literal-minded reader mad. The Danish historian of philosophy, Harald Høffding, says of Hegel's phenomenology, "The course of development described in this unique work is at once that of the individual and of the race. It gives at the same time a psychology and a history of culture, and in the exposition the two are so interconnected that but rather a phenomenology of the
Okay, so
technical
let's back
state
up.
of mind.
I lost track in the PDF.
Like Hegel's
so
book, it is intensely histrionic, and like it shows without offering causal mechanisms how its subject, in its lowest stage, technique as machine technique, develops dialectically through the various higher stages to become at last the fully evolved phenomenon, the technical phenomenon identical with the technical society. Again, as with Hegel, how its subject is a phenomenology of mind, but rather a phenomenology of the technical state of mind. Like Hegel's book, it is intensely histrionic, and like it shows without offering causal mechanisms how its subject, in its lowest stage, technique as machine technique, develops dialectically through the various higher stages to become at last the fully evolved phenomenon, the technical phenomenon identical with the technical society. Again, as with Hegel, what the philosopher J. Lowenberg has called
that was a super crucial point, because I experienced that while I was first consuming this piece of material.
Technique is machine technique. Develops dialectics chose without offering causal mechanisms.
So it's saying Hegel's book,
state of mind,
intensely histrionic,
but rather a phenomenology of the technical state of mind.
Now it's saying they might not
like
offer
Hegel,
causal
rather,
mechanisms.
The technological society is not a phenomenology of comparison.
How its subject shows its
The technological society is not a phenomenology
technique
of mind,
as machine technique,
but rather a phenomenology of the technical state of mind. Like Hegel's book, it is intensely histrionic, and like it shows without offering causal mechanisms how its subject, in its lowest stage, technique as machine technique, develops dialectically through the various higher stages to become at last the fully evolved phenomenon, the technical phenomenon identical with the technical society. Again, as with Hegel, what the philosopher J. Lowenberg has called the histrionic irony of statement must drive the literal-minded reader mad. The Danish historian of philosophy, Harald Høffding, says of Hegel's phenomenology, "The course of development described in this unique work is at once that of the individual and of the race. It gives at the same time a psychology and a history of culture, and in the exposition the two are so interwoven that it is often impossible to tell which of the two is intended."
Okay,
with
so
the stipulation
I'm going to give a
that
pause right here for a brief side note on the 5 stupidities of English. So one of the first points that the content creator Heron Stone was trying to communicate in terms of bridging a bit of linguistic culture commentary to this present moment, where he says, his basic thesis is downstream of general semantics. And I guess, this is a placeholder at about 24 minutes. So in the future, if you look up, right up at the top of your screen, you might see a card with our reaction video to the 5 stupidities of English. One of the first or second ones was this distinction between A and the. This distinction between A and the, and whether or not one is better than the other for the context of clarity and consistency in analytical thought. Okay, so let's keep on going.
Ellul is treating of culture in the sense of the technological society. Høffding's penetrating remark holds as well for Ellul's book. In such a work, it is impossible to separate method from content. Yet, in another sense, and especially for a translator, it is imperative to do so. Although, after the time of Descartes, French savants in general were preoccupied with clarifying problems of method, it has been almost impossible in the 20th century to extort from French writers on sociology and economics an adequate account of their procedures. Some of them have doubtless been oversensitive to Poincaré's famous jibe concerning the sciences, with the most methods and the fewest results. In Ellul's case, however, disinclination to discuss methodology specifically is almost certainly due in large part to his pervasive distrust of anything at all resembling a fixed doctrine. Nevertheless, throughout the book are scattered a large number of references to method, and it is possible and necessary to reconstruct from them a satisfactory account of the author's methodology. Ellul first situates the facts of experience in a general context, and then proceeds to focus them. This figure of speech, drawn from, or at least appropriate to, descriptive astronomy, appears over and over again in connection with each supervening stage of complexity of the subject matter, or at least appropriate to. This figure of speech, context, and then proceeds to focus them, the facts of experience. Ellul first situates the facts of experience in a general context.
Okay, that's number
and
one.
then proceeds to focus them. This figure of speech, drawn from, or at least appropriate to, descriptive astronomy, appears over and over again in connection with each supervening stage of complexity of the subject matter. The final result of the procedure is to bring to a common focal point rays proceeding from very different spheres. The reader should be warned that it is only possible to approximate in English the mixed metaphors and the studied imprecisions of each new beginning of the process, which are gradually refined to yield, at the focus, a precise terminology. The translator was always uncomfortably aware of too little precision, or too much, in his choice of English words. The reader seriously interested in these nuances has no recourse but to consult the original. The translator can do little more for him than to call his attention to the problem. Anyone familiar with similar dialectic moments in the works of Hegel or of Max Weber will understand at once what is meant. Ellul repeats again and again that he is concerned not to make value judgments, but to report things as they are. One might be tempted to smile at such statements in view of the intensely personal and even impassioned quality of a work in which one is never for a moment unaware where the author's own sympathies lie. Nonetheless, on balance, it seems clear that he has not allowed his own value judgments to intrude in any illegitimate way on questions of fact. Fact is very important to Ellul, but only as experienced in the context of the whole. Facts as they figure in uninterpreted statistical analyses of a given domain, or as they may be revealed by opinion polls and in newspapers, are anathema to him. Which one is never for a moment unaware where the author's own sympathies lie. Nonetheless, on balance, it seems clear that he has not allowed his own value judgments to intrude in any illegitimate way on questions of fact. Fact is very important to Ellul, but only as experienced in the context of the whole. Facts as they figure in uninterpreted statistical analyses of a given domain, or as they may be revealed by opinion polls and in newspapers, are anathema to him. And he permits himself many diatribes against this kind of abstract, disembodied fact, which is so dear to the hearts of Americans, at least as Ellul imagines them to be. With this proviso, Ellul can echo the dictum of Hegel's phenomenology that the only imaginable point of departure of philosophy is experience. The insistence on rendering a purely phenomenological account of fact, without causal explanation of the interrelation of the subordinate facts, may seem distasteful to some readers. Since Aristotle, it has been a common conception of science that we have knowledge rendering a purely phenomenological account of fact, without The insistence on rendering a purely phenomenological account of fact, without causal explanation of the interrelation of the subordinate facts, may seem distasteful to some readers. Since Aristotle, it has been a common conception of science that we have knowledge only when we know the why. Admittedly, whenever causal knowledge is available, it is indeed valuable. But it ought not to be forgotten that such knowledge is increasingly hard to come by, and in fact hardly makes its appearance at all in modern physics, say, where one must, for the most part, be content with purely functional, that is, phenomenological equations which dispense with any appeal to mechanism, but which are nonetheless adequate for prediction and explanation, and which have the enormous additional advantage of containing no hidden concepts unconfrontable by experience.
Okay, I have to pause this. This is one of those interesting sections where I decided to take notes and to include page numbers X and V, specifically because it doubles back to where we're at in terms of Hume, David Hume's work, and thinking about, okay, so what is human nature in general versus what can we learn versus what do we know. In this context, we're jumping in and we're looking and we're performing an analysis of this. We're taking time to see and to look and say, okay, so how does this relate to a treatise on human nature, and in what context? So let's see if we can replay this sentence, and then we'll get to the end of this paragraph, and then we'll pick this back up in our next entry.
Important question, that is, phenomenologically makes its appearance at all in modern physics, say, where one must, for the most part, be content with purely functional, that is, phenomenological equations which dispense with any appeal to mechanism, but which are nonetheless adequate for prediction and explanation, and which have the enormous makes its appearance at all in modern physics, say, where one must, for the most part, be content with purely functional, that is, phenomenological equations, experience. The insistence on rendering a purely phenomenological account of fact, without causal explanation of the interrelation of the subordinate facts, may seem distasteful to some readers. Since Aristotle, it has been a common conception of science that we have knowledge only when we know the why. Admittedly, whenever causal knowledge is available, it is indeed valuable. But it ought not to be forgotten that such knowledge is increasingly hard to come by, and in fact hardly makes its appearance at all in modern physics, say, where one must, for the most part, be content with purely functional, that is, phenomenological equations which dispense with any appeal to mechanism, but which are nonetheless adequate for prediction and explanation, and which have the enormous additional advantage of containing no hidden concepts unconfrontable by experience. The important questions concerning the technological society rarely turn for Ellul on how or why things came to be so, but rather on whether his description of them is a true one. Ellul's methodology is fundamentally dominated by the principle which has come to be called Engel's law, that is, the law asserting the passage of quantity into quality. To give a commonplace example, the city, after it reaches a certain threshold of population.
Okay, so when we pick this back up, we're going to jump back into where we left off on page XV, leading into XVI. Probably should brush up on my Roman numeral numbering title schema. But yeah, this has been entry number 2, part 2 in our ongoing series, breaking down and reacting to the technological society and making an attempt to convey how this channel at As an Aggregator thinks about the term technique. It's become a foundational part of our lexicon over the past few years, and I thought that I'd take you on my journey of discovering, well, how do I relate to technique, and how does technique relate to the larger content consumption landscape? Remember, if you have found this content, I mean, really, truly, thank you for discovering this and making it to the end, because early game analytics, woo, being a content creator, you have to really love your niche, unless, well, it depends on the type of content you're making. But regardless, hey, if you have found this content and are looking for what to do next, establish conscious competence over the content you consume today by adding videos you watch into a playlist right now. Right now, don't hesitate. You can establish conscious competence over the content you consume today by adding videos you watch into a playlist right now.